the US right now, so different parts of the world and different time zones. So good afternoon from New York. I don't know, good evening from Cairo, and good night from Dubai. I have no clue. I really, I'm terrible at time zones. But
good afternoon,
Dina and I are going to have a conversation today about Egyptian narrative representation on the Western stage. And we can start our presentation.
And it's very much loosely based on a lot of experiences that we had. So definitely, if you have thoughts, please save them for the end.
Please, yeah. We will have like a 30-minute Q&A at the end. So it would be great if you can like think about your questions, type them down, take notes, and then we can have a conversation and a discussion afterwards. So who are we? Dina, who are you?
Well, I'm a costume designer. I was born and raised in the UK, but I moved to Egypt when I was 18, which is kind of where I discovered theater and costume design. And I eventually like worked my way up to designer and decided to go to grad school and ended up here in New York, studied at NYU, and now I work prior to COVID, I worked as a costume designer, basically in the New York theater industry. Did a lot of stuff in the MENA, Middle Eastern, North African theater community. So very interested in this topic of representation, especially at a time like this.
You want to highlight or uplift certain projects that you really enjoyed working on?
I worked on like I don't know if she called it autobiographical, but it's definitely based on her life. But this really great musical called Ida, Questions for My Father, which is about like an Egyptian American experience and trying to connect to her roots. And you know, like as a third culture kid, I identified with that as well. But also, like you just never see anything. You very rarely see anything specifically Egyptian that isn't through. That is kind of. It was very family oriented, and I like that.
Yeah, that was a beautiful piece.
And the music was just amazing.
Yeah, and as an Egyptian and the audience member, definitely there were a lot of elements in it that were so true and specific to what is Egyptian, and I was floored by the fact that all of those details existed.
Just the way it normalized, for instance, the veil, and you had two veiled women leading these songs about like just wanting to be like just to be, you know.
Yes. Well, we'll get to that in a second. Cool. Thank you, Dina. Well, I'm happy that you're still a costume designer, COVID or not. So know
Tell
that.
us about you.
I am I'm a dramaturg. I'm from Egypt. I did not discover dramaturgy in Egypt. I did discover theater in Egypt as a child, and had other lines of work, not in theater, in other departments, like in public relations, advertising, filmmaking. But came a point in my life that I was like, nope, I want to study this and I want to really be good at it, since I love storytelling. And the road led me to Columbia, the dramaturgy program over there. I graduated in 2016. And after a long, stressful process with the visa, I now can say that for at least 2 years now, I'm a freelance dramaturg, with no other descriptions to my title. I also work predominantly with the MENA theater community here. I love and gravitate towards Egyptian narratives and stories. Hence, when Karim Fahmy brilliant artist, wanted to adapt the Kubian building, I was like, yes, let's do it. So that's me. Post-COVID, or I don't know. I love stories, so I'm still a dramaturg. I'll keep on doing it. Hopefully, this country lets me. But that's it. That's who we are. And what are we talking about? I mean, we ventured a little bit on that, Dina and I, but we're talking about representation, Egyptian representation through a Western lens. Just to give a disclaimer, when we first started this conversation, it was meant to be around theater projects and theater storytelling, but we found ourselves expanding into other visual storytelling. So we'll be talking about films and film representation, TV representations, and theater. So that's what we're talking about. Why are we talking about it, Dina? What sparked it?
We're talking about it because, you know, it's definitely prevalent in this time when we're talking about accurate representation. Also, sometimes it feels like we're not always aware of our own lens. I, as a British Egyptian, you know, I'm not always cognizant of the fact that my British upbringing will affect how I portray an Egyptian in Egypt, in Cairo, you know, wherever. I might not fully appreciate that perhaps my concern for creating work for a specific audience might affect how I interpret, you know, what it is, the subject that I'm talking about. So that's kind of why I'm interested in talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me too. And that's what got us together into this. What we're hoping to achieve out of this conversation is re-examine certain themes or selected themes that Dina and I worked on together and showcase opportunities for more nuanced representation on the Western stage, at least the Egyptian culture that I come from. We've often noticed that there are certain tropes that are only being seen as tropes in the Western storytelling lens. And very, very, very often, like slim to none, you'd find an example of a story that looks into why that trope became a trope and the cultural weight and history behind that practice that could be presented as a trope through a Western lens. So that's what we're hoping to achieve today.
Yeah, and to expand on that as well, I think sometimes there's a fear of delving into something that is, say, iconically Egyptian because of this concern of portraying it as a trope rather than examining the cultural dynamics that created the image in the first place.
Mm-hmm. So what often happens is, to shy away from it, there will be either complete erasure of that trope and not really examining it, or presenting it in that stereotypical form. So whatever lies in between that spectrum never gets, interpreted, which takes us to the next point. We had a long discussion about what is adaptation. There is the practical functional adaptation, which is if you want to adapt from one storytelling form to another, if you want to adapt from a novel to stage, from stage to screen, from screen to TV, and in any other order. That's the functional one. And then there's the cultural one. As a producer or as someone who decides to bring a story from a different culture, I feel we always need to examine ourselves. Why do we want to bring that story? Do we want to bring that story because the story within itself needs to be uplifted, or do we also want to represent that culture? Well, the reason why it's been hard to identify adaptation for us, at least for Dina and I, is that the term adaptation, especially when it's cultural adaptation, not being specified as such, but cultural adaptation is used so loosely here in the West that what happens is that the project gets Americanized or Westernized, or the cultural themes in the project or in the narrative get tweaked a little bit so that they can fit, or they can appease the Western audience member. That exists in other parts of the world, but it's not just called adaptation. A big example of that is what I have written down here. Egyptian storytellers have for years adapted and took works internationally to bring them to their Egyptian audience, but realizing that culturally you cannot tell that story in the same way because every culture has its own limitations. they called it Egyptianization. So there is a difference between just adapting a work or translating the work, or Egyptianizing the work as in making it your own. What we've seen here is that works that should be representing our culture on stages or on TV that are adapted, but they're absolutely westernized, and they are being reinterpreted through a Western lens without the acknowledgement of that.
Yeah, I think there's this assumption that adaptation is a neutral term, but actually in truth, if you're taking a piece of work and creating it so that it's more understandable or more relatable to the audience that you're presenting it to, you've already lost whatever neutral assumptions that the term has. So what I love about the Egyptianization is that it acknowledges through adapting, we are creating it for a specific audience. So what we're trying to do is challenge this assumption that adaptation is neutral.
And Dina, you had an example about, and I mean, there are so many examples. I can spend forever on them, but yeah, Dina had an awesome example about
so
that.
An example of an Egyptian adaptation is the story Jane Eyre. I guess many Egyptians here would know it's like the film Hazel Rajul Uhibbu. Sorry if you haven't read Jane Eyre, I'm going to spoil it, but
just for people to know, it was the one starred by Magda and Yahya Shaheen.
Yeah.
Back in the 50s.
So in order to solve the issue of Mr. Rochester not being able to marry Jane Eyre because his first wife is still alive, in the Egyptian version, I forgot Mr. Rochester's name, they made it so, like in Christianity, you obviously can't marry more than one woman, but since in Islam, these are Muslim characters, in the Egyptian version, they made their first wife, Jane Eyre or Sabrine, in the film, they made it her sister. So it was things like that.
Because in Islam, as a man, even though you can marry 4 women, you cannot marry 2 sisters at the same time.
Yeah.
So they Egyptianized an obstacle that was.
And this is, of course, separate to all the other nuances of setting it in Egypt and the time period and things like that.
So yeah, that's one example. I mean, there are others, as we see Fouad al-Mohandes, to most of us Egyptians who know him, in our logo. He Egyptianized a lot of works. Famously, he Egyptianized My Fair Lady. And like Eliza Doolittle's character transformed completely from her being a flower girl and not being able to speak eloquently to becoming this hilariously funny and playful pocket thief, and so that we get to go to Egyptian slums and witness the Egyptian slums in a way that does not exist in the original work. But again, we can expand on that for hours, but that's an example of Egyptianization and how adaptation cannot always be used as a term very neutrally, and the opposite of it. So, Dina, you were saying something earlier about the veil. Can we, because that's an awesome segue to what we want to discuss later.
So, I suppose after years of seeing interpretations of the poor Muslim woman that had to be veiled, the poor subjugated woman, blah, blah, blah. Understandably, the hijabi Muslim community in the US has been very openly critical and said, no, we very much want to wear the veil because we love the veil, whatever, they find it empowering. So, and I support that. However, that doesn't erase the fact that there are people who are still forced to wear the veil. So it's not to say that we should continue to have these tropes, but it's also to say we shouldn't just focus on the empowerment of it, or there can live a spectrum of those that are forced and those that are empowered. So our interest really is challenging this binary and the creating more stories that live within the spectrum.
So, well, not moving on, but connecting to that, the themes that we want to challenge today, or want to remove them being binary and actually looking into them as they're more complex than how they get portrayed, are, I'm just going to read them out right now, and we're going to go through them in details, but it's victimization versus empowerment, exotic versus the not, a disparaging versus romanticizing representation, religious culture versus secular culture.
We're just highlighting some examples, but there are obviously other things that we could focus on as well in the future.
Yeah, we've been having this conversation, Dina and I, for the last 4 weeks, and we can easily talk for like 3 hours straight about just one of those points. So we're not going to do that today, but so we tried to handpick what is, you know, simple, quick examples that convey what we want to say. So the first theme is the victimization versus empowerment. I think talking about the veil felt a little bit like a good segue into that, but it's how often women having to survive certain conditions conditions in Egypt, when seen from a Western lens, could be seen as this woman as powerless. Well, yes, the conditions could be very disadvantaged. Like they cause Okay, Dina, you take this on. It's a tongue twister for me right now.
Let me just jump right into the example. For instance, Scheherazade from 1001 Nights. I've worked on a few projects. I have an ongoing project with a theatre company, and we've had a bunch of discussions about her role in the 1001 Nights. Those of us who grew up with Scheherazade or Shahrazad, she's an iconic figure. She's somebody who has, she's considered a heroine. But in these discussions that I had in these groups here in the US, a lot of it is, well, she lacks any kind of power. She is forced into this marriage. She's raped on a nightly basis. And that's not in line with quite how we have been raised to see her. I'm not necessarily arguing that marriage justifies any kind of rape or any kind of rape.
Yeah.
Presumption that Shahrazad didn't have any personal autonomy or wasn't using her sexuality in order to drive her own destiny forward is just something that's missing in this narrative here in the US. It's not to say that these issues do not exist, but the assumption that this is Shahrazad's story is just the prevalent notion here in the US.
Yeah, and how she used both her intellect and sexuality as a weapon against Shahrazad, as opposed to them being used against her. Yeah. Which is, I think, the whole rape narrative is that.
Because also the text doesn't even say, I'm also not justifying it. The text doesn't even say she was raped. It just says she was deflowered. Well, deflowered can mean a million things. It doesn't necessarily mean she was deflowered without her consent. But also acknowledging it was written at a different time.
Yeah. Another modern example, since I mentioned the Kubian building earlier, I've often found this example hard to interpret to certain Western audiences, but I'll try. So there's a character in the novel which is what we see on the left is the actress that played that role in the movie when it was adapted into a movie. From the novel. She is a second wife of a very prominent corrupt politician and businessman. She marries him because she wants to support her child from her first marriage, and she needs someone to rely, like she needs some safety in her life, at least economic. So she agrees to some conditions that aren't the best, but she agrees to being the second wife, she agrees to being the secret wife, and she agrees to not having a child from her second marriage at all, and not seeing her first child as often as she would like to. Again, from the outside, it is, yes, this woman could feel or seem powerless. What happens halfway through the narrative is that she decides that one of those conditions do not work for her at all. I don't want to give away the story, but she decides that one of those conditions are not going to work for her, and she fights nail and tooth, and she stands against that very powerful, corrupt man to get what she wants. Granted, she doesn't get her way at the end, but she fights, and it's really hard for me to see her through a powerless lens, because as we've mentioned earlier, she was not forced into, but she had to live and survive certain heinous conditions, that she had to make a life of her own. And then when they didn't work out for her, she just stood up for herself. Not to say that everyone who had lost a battle in history has been a victim or powerless. And interpreting her, like, I'm grateful enough that I'm so grateful that the collaborator that I'm working with on that adaptation for the stage absolutely 100% agrees with my point of view on that. But that was a question we were asked often about her, and like when I'm just discussing the novel with other people, is that Saïd cannot be seen as, it's hard for them to see her as a powerful woman, especially because she's a second wife, which then takes us into like their views of Islam, and why would a woman ever agree to be a second wife, and which again, like, so much nuance into the culture for it to be judged from the outsider Western lens and then interpreted. So those are two examples that we have about victimization versus empowerment. Then we are going to segue to the exotic versus the not. That's going to be a long discussion for a second. Dina, do you want to say what's been, like, you have an anecdote about that?
Yeah, I would find that the biggest like cringy moments have been, you know, when the belly dancers come out, and not necessarily on my end, you know, it depends, but I found that there's this resistance. Either there's the tropey portrayals, which we all hate, but there's also this sort of resistance that I found in the MENA community to present belly dancers in their text, with the argument being, well, we don't want to reduce women to just being a belly dancer, which is fair. I understand that. But at the same time, you know, Egypt has a long tradition and history of belly dancing. And it's not necessarily just that one thing that we see, and it's the image on the left. That's obviously an Orientalist Western gaze that has been imposed onto this, you know, traditional and folk type of dancing. And that is absolutely not to say that that doesn't exist in modern Egypt, but there is also a history, and a history of variety as well in types of dance and clothing. So it just feels a shame to self-censor and say, well, we don't want to reduce women to that.
So that's a trope that sometimes the community chooses to completely erase from the narrative so that we don't get stereotyped.
Yeah. So examples of such.
Can we spend a minute with the images here for a second? Yeah, I mean, the image on the left is clearly, I don't know if it's your left or my left, but my left for sure.
You're exotic.
It's the exotic imperialist view into what a belly dancer should look like. I just have to just say a disclaimer that the belly dancing history in Egypt has been, yes, often women do get subjugated for being objects, but like sexual objects, but at the same time we cannot deny we have institutions like Samia Gamal and like Tahia Karioka, who have Tahia Karioka on her own. She created a new school of dance, of belly dancing, and what's the word, like she rejected a lot of Western dance and wanted to bring back indigenous movements. But within that also, that lady was a ferocious activist. Another example of how belly dancers have used they are exotic, but how they use that exoticization against other people. A large community of the belly dancing community during the British occupation used to lure British soldiers. So they used their own objectification against the soldiers. So it's very hard. Yeah. So that's just a little bit into a sneak peek into the history of how that just belly dancing is not just that sexualized exotic thing. There is more to it. There's craft. There are various costumes other than the ones that we stereotypically see. Even the movements themselves are sometimes different, with the emphasis on what is sexual and what is crafty. The image on the right is an image of Farida Fahmy, who was part of the Rida group that I believe inaugurated either in the late 1950s or 1960s. And they have transformed how belly dancing could be viewed in the larger mainstream media. So they've embraced folkloric dance, they embrace indigenous dance, and as you see in this image, she's not danced in that skimpy belly dancing costume. Not to say that it doesn't exist, but she's not dressed in it, and she's still dancing, and she is wearing an Alexandrian woman costume.
Yeah, her costume doesn't take anything away from the dance at all.
Yeah. So we have more examples to show the variations, and I'm going to give the screen to Dina so she can show it.
Okay, so an example of the typical Western type of dance, and you're all probably familiar with it. So as you can see, like, certain things about belly dancing have been cherry-picked so that the emphasis is on her body and on her sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
And there are tidbits here and there that imply sort of cultural heritage, but everything is about her figure, basically. Mm-hmm. Whereas an example of
Dina, do you mind turning down the volume of the videos a little bit when you're speaking so we can hear you?
Yes.
Thank
An
you.
example of like the different types of belly dance, of a different type of belly dance, not different, would be this one. So as you can see, that with this particular image, it's not necessarily focused on the nudity of her body or the showing of skin. But the movements are similar, but the emphasis is not on her sexuality per se. Not to say that in conservative society this wouldn't be considered an issue, but the implication that the dance itself is about sexuality is the focus is different here when it's interpreted from our lens.
Mm-hmm. And the well, I don't want to call it stick because I don't want to butcher it, but the cane that she's dancing with is part of a dance called hattaba in the indigenous Egyptian culture. So she's anyway.
That's something you wouldn't know about because we're just catered to see, you know, this type of imagery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then there's an imagery that no one, well, that's before getting into that very last imagery, Dina, I think the reason why we also decided to talk about belly dancing is because yes, it could be used as for sexualization and, you know, all of those tropes and stereotypes that we're used to. It's also a day-to-day practice that women do, especially in Egypt. I don't know about other parts of the world, but I know that in Egypt, women dance. They belly dance when they're in parties together. They belly dance behind closed doors. They belly dance outside in other parties. it's an expression of joy, and it's not that much of a big production in order to do it. You don't have to dress that way in order to dance. You just dance, and dancing and moving your body is part of just expressing joy. And I think that segues us into the other video, that the last video that Dina has for us about belly dancing.
Enjoy. See, I mean, they're doing very similar moves. There's not necessarily anything inherently sexual about what they're doing. They're on a boat, there's family, there's kids. It's just, there's one kid right there, it's just normal, you know? There's nothing exotic or orientalist about it.
Yeah, and as we can see, this exists in like, it's not public, but it looks like it's probably taking place at a boat or something. It's like and there are families around, there's a veiled woman in the back, like it's not exclusive to a certain sexual image or sexual function. Thank you, Dina. Yeah, those are great videos. Thank you. All right. Can you wait?
Stop share.
Yes. Can you please give me hostmanship again? Thank you. Screen share. Right. Sorry. There we go. Here we are. All right. So this was the exotic versus the not. Dina, what's the other theme that we have?
The next one is, oh, you wanted to segue into, shoot.
It's okay. I have it. The disparaging versus the romanticizing.
I was the one that banged on about this for ages and I forgot it.
That's okay. Well, I mean, those are your examples. I have one example at the end, but I'll give you the floor for those two. Go for it.
Yes. So once again, in this binary of like wanting to succumb to tropes, but at the same time wanting to empower, but like ignoring the reality of the lived existence. You know, this like I continue to find that problematic because it just doesn't provide a nuanced perspective. So I was gonna say shout out to like X-Men Apocalypse for you know, creating accurate representation of, you know, Egyptian advertisements in the 1980s and made it look very authentic. But on the flip side of that, they, in terms of the people, they represented Cairo as one giant market in the 1980s, which, you know, as many of us Egyptians know, that's not the case. Yes, it's true that there are certain areas within Cairo that are that way, but the assumption that Cairo is not a metropolitan city is just another example of how a lens can affect a portrayal. And the same goes with Rami on the flip side. Like Rami, great show, did you know, has done a lot of good in terms of representation of Egyptians on screen, but at the same time, you know, Rami did a wonderful thing of showing like his grandfather and where he lived in the countryside. And that's great, but at the same time, it's a very romanticized, very clean, very catered image. But also, if you watch the episode, he spends a lot of time trying to get to go, you know, trying to go to his father. I think it's like a good 8 minutes or something trying to go to his father, but you only spend maybe half that time actually in the countryside. I'm not saying Rami's obliged to do that, but at the same time, it's a very catered, tailored, romanticized lens.
And not to say that the countryside in Egypt is not gorgeous, but
yeah,
also.
But it's you know, with Rami, it took the opposite extreme, like the romanticized imagery of the countryside. It's not necessarily in itself a negative portrayal. However, it doesn't necessarily or it makes the imagery more palatable to a unfamiliar cosmopolitan audience who wouldn't necessarily understand the dichotomy of living in the Egyptian countryside, or wouldn't know the layers that come with it.
Yep. I haven't seen Rami yet, but
sorry, I spoiled it.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I have an example. It's not about Egypt, but well, it could be. But it's from the show Tyrant. We don't have images from it here because copyrights. But I don't know if any of you are familiar with the show, but the show existed after the Arab Spring, and it had a made-up country in the Middle East where lives a tyrant, rules a tyrant. And after 5 or 6 episodes, I didn't know, something was not sitting well with me with that show. And then later I realized what it was. If you even look at the set design of that show, it looks like everything that could have possibly been Orientalist have been spit up into that scene. Like, you can tell that someone was trying so hard so that when you turn on your screen, you're like, oh, I'm in Arabia, or oh, I'm in the Middle East. And it's not even just not an accurate representation. It's a heightened, maybe romanticized representation, a little bit of how our homes look like in the Arab world. So that was one of the things visually that really got to me. The other thing is, it's not visual, but it's more about a bit of a Western view, I think, of some savagery tropes or our Arab relationship is that the son of the tyrant used to personally go beat up people and kill them with his bare hands, and like there's a lot of bloodshed on his own. It exists that yes, a son of a tyrant who is that corrupt would be the cause of death of a lot of people, but he doesn't do that with his own hands. There was something about that felt so enforced. The man with that power from that part of the world, and I felt, and this is why I'm talking about it, because I felt it was a bit of a shade or trying to comment on the Mubarak family. And for sure his sons did not physically go exert violence on people. They gave orders, but yeah. And I think it bothered me because I just felt that this is like, from a very Western lens, if you're a powerful man, and also because you're an Arab, of course you're going to, do the violence yourself.
Yeah, it's the implication that we are inherently very physically violent people.
And angry, and we can't really sustain our own temper was very problematic for me. And I couldn't see the rest of the show. For so many other reasons, but those are the two elements in it that just were not sitting well with me at all. Cool. All right. Then this takes us to another theme that is the religious culture versus the secular culture. Okay, so we're going to talk about the images, but before the images, we want to talk a little bit about language. One of the things that has been not just not sitting well with me, but I've had often have to explain to people around here is that Allah is not a different God from the monotheistic God. He is this, or he or she or they, the same. Islam does not have its own separate God from the other monotheistic God. And within that, because of that misinterpretation, because of that misunderstanding, I'd often see characters that speak English fluently throughout the entire narrative, and then when they get to mention God, they say Allah. And that is, to someone like myself, is problematic, because you are creating that distinction between God, like different gods. It's the same. If I'm speaking in English and I'm praying to God, I will say God. If I'm speaking in Arabic, I'll say Allah. If I want to, colloquialize it in Egyptian, I'll say Rabbina. That's it. It's as simple as that. But that misinterpretation, that has been predominantly taken over the media and also the stages, that I found myself having those arguments with very enlightened, well-read people, that they're like, oh, wait, Allah is, wait, I thought you had a different God. I'm like, no, we don't. So that's one of the things in the language that I often find in the religious culture hard to swallow.
Yeah.
When it comes to Western representation, or it being represented through a Western lens. Dina, there was another language.
Well, I think I wanted to add to that point, is that yes, there are groups within the US, that Muslim groups specifically, that will very much prefer to identify and say as Allah and like things like that, and we're not discounting that. But when we're specifically referencing Egyptians,
yeah,
this is what we're talking about. Like, it's not necessarily going to be, you're not necessarily always going to say Salam alaikum when you enter a room. Sometimes you judge beforehand what the occasion needs. Like when I come into a room where my mother is at, I'm not going to say Salam alaikum, I'm going to say hi mama, you know. Or if I go visit relatives and it's a slightly formal environment, I might say Salam alaikum. Or if I enter a taxi, I might say Salam alaikum.
And not every woman who's dressed in a veil says Salam alaikum when she's walking in and out of a place.
Yeah, and I might go meet friends and be like, "Izzayak," or "How are you?" and things like that. So it's also worth noting that there needs to be more of a variety of, I guess, language with regards to, or noting that there needs to be a variety in Muslim language with representation in Egyptian identity.
And in any other identities as well, in the sense of like, not all Islamic nations use Salam alaikum and inshallah all the time. Every single country and every single culture and every single district within those countries have other terminologies. And if you are telling a story of someone from a specific place, then just, you know, research it a little bit more and find out what else do they say other than Salam alaikum and inshallah.
Because those affects like the way you're interpreting the family. You're interpreting them as suddenly stricter or a lot more religious than they might actually be. And it's true that there are some Egyptian Muslim families that, you know, will insist on Salam alaikum all the time. So that's where it has to go into play in your storytelling and deciding, well, I consciously want to make this family like this and that family like that.
And of course, like, just a disclaimer, not to be exclusionary, but when we're talking about religious culture, we mean like Islamic religious culture representation versus secular one. This is us not talking about the Coptic community in Egypt.
Which some of them do say Salam alaikum, you know, it's
but yes, so those images. I was so happy to find the image on the left. Most Egyptians in this room will also understand why it sparks so much joy. But but before discussing that, Dina, what was the anecdote about?
On a couple of productions I've worked on and stuff that I've seen occasionally in Islamic or Islamic American media or things of such, is that there's a lot of emphasis or focus on the ritual of prayer and this need to emphasize how beautiful it is, whereas, you know, in Egypt it might be something completely mundane. You know, I've worked on productions where the whole scene is dedicated to someone like praying, which is not to say that it doesn't happen and it hasn't happened in the past, but it's problematic when every single prayer scene becomes about, it has to be a moment of prayer. But then for people in cultures like ours, this is normalized, you know, that seeing people praying on a regular basis 5 times a day and hearing the adhan and stuff like that, these things are normal. It would be normal for us to see someone take out a piece of cardboard and pray in the street. So it very much feels like when there's this overemphasis of this particular practice, it feels like a tokenization of it. And one has to be careful when one uses it, you know. It can't always be like we have these great epiphanies 5 times a day, you know.
Or at least again, speaking for the Egyptian culture or about the Egyptian culture. An example of that is the image that's on the left. I mean, that movie is a socio-political comedy movie, but this entire scene was about a government employee, the guy on the left who has his hands on his belly because he's praying. He decides it's time to pray, so he prays in the middle of his office. It does not become a production. It does not become this big moment. It's a practice that he does every single day at a certain time. And that's that. And then he's going to go about his day. And it's not a thing that's going to stop you at your tracks if you go in and you see someone praying. You're not. It's something we're used to see and live with.
It's not something performative for a white audience so that they can understand how beautiful the religion is.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, Dina, shall we move on?
We did have one more note about the language being secularized,
Mm-hmm.
about how things like inshallah and mashallah
Right.
normal, just everyday terms that are not necessarily weighted in religious belief.
Yeah, they don't carry the same weight.
Yeah,
and that's just to show what we're talking about here, how religious practice and religious terminologies are weaved into our day-to-day, that they are used secularly a lot, which is again why right now you said that some, I can't say all, but some of the Coptic community in Egypt also use those words, because it got normalized in the sense that everyone just uses them every single day. When I tell my mom or anyone's like Rabbina ma'ak, I don't mean it in the weight of like may God be with. It's when it gets translated, it feels that heavy, while in our day-to-day it really isn't. You're just wishing someone good, like, you're just wishing them well. I wish you well. That's the casual weight of it. So yeah, that's it about language and Islamic religious culture versus a secular culture. Dina, is there something else that we want to discuss before we move on to our conclusions and recommendations?
I think we're good.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. So our recommendations based on our discussions is that I feel to anyone who decides to produce a work about Egypt in a place that is not Egypt, is to shift the focus to accurate representation, and then your audience will automatically become global. And global shouldn't mean that you change things. Global shouldn't mean that changes were made so that the subject becomes easily understood.
Yeah, an example of that, sorry, I'm jumping in.
I wanted you to say that example, yes.
Is in the US, you create shows that are screened globally, i.e. Friends, i.e. Seinfeld, and plays, and you don't give a second thought as to, well, who's the audience? Because the assumption is that the audience is going to understand. Mm. And that's true. Like, people watch Friends globally and understood the content. However, when global works come to the US, there's always this concern, and it dates back to all my costume design classes that I've been to. There's always this concern of, oh, will your audience understand, because this is something they're unfamiliar with. Mm-hmm. And it just bothers me because the flow of representation or the flow of information is not accurate. So if the US is going to assume that everyone's going to understand them, then it should be the other way around as well. Mm-hmm. And actually, I'm going to segue into, there was this talk that Riz Ahmed did in 2017 in the Houses of Parliament, and he gave this really great example about these characters facing these big challenges and going through steep learning curves. And then he ended the conversation with, the character we're watching is a fish or a bunny rabbit. So if you guys can identify with a fish and a bunny rabbit, then you can make the effort to identify with a culture that you don't necessarily.
Yeah, it's understanding the rules of the world, and you don't have to make that world your own in order to understand it. Yeah. Oh, I like that example.
I know, I love him.
Cool. All right, Dina, do you want to move on to our conclusions?
Yes.
Our conclusion.
Yeah, I think I hinted a little bit in my rant, obviously. Who is your audience? I don't think we should keep asking who the audience is. I think the focus should be on if somebody from that culture that you're representing is going to watch, you have to assume that somebody from that culture is going to watch the show. countless times I've been told, well, no one's going to know. You can't work that way, because then automatically the piece is not representative. You have to acknowledge that you have this lens that filters what information that you're presenting on stage. And I'm not saying everybody is going to be able to miraculously lose it, but you can be cognizant of that and take as many steps as you can to challenge that lens. And you know, within this time of this paradigm shift of more inclusion, you know, include more of the people that are experts in this.
How many times have you seen a show that was from our culture that got interpreted through a Western lens, and you as an Egyptian audience sitting in there got alienated yourself, and you're like, well, this does not work for me?
And you can't say anything because you're always counteracted with, well, this is we're in America, this is the American audience, and stuff like that. And it's, well, how's the American audience going to learn if you're not presenting it the way it should be? You know, so it's just also just
not to also be critical of things in the culture, but still represent it, and then be critical of it, but don't put a white lens on it.
Yeah. Just, I think we always just have to remind ourselves that we live in, like someone once said to me, we live in a world of absolutes, and I don't think that's true at all. We have to recognize that there's a spectrum of, and we have to reimagine like the complexities of each culture, and challenge this binary type of thinking of, let me show the positives and let me show the negatives.
Or that it's only that or only, like it's not one or the other. It's yes and.
And part of that problem is like the lack of the number of shows. Like Rami is a great show, but I hope for 1,000 other Egyptian shows.
Great, thank you, Dina. This is great. I always love this discussion. Well, we actually ended our presentation 5 minutes early, but we're ready to take some Q&A. And if people want to like start showing their videos, and also they can talk to us, they can raise your hand and we can talk. That could be a conversation. I'm going to stop share right now. Oh, wow. We have a lot in the chat here. Cool.
Hi.
Hello, hi.
Hey, question. I just wondering, this is sort of off the base, but I'm wondering if Netflix has been putting in investment in Europe, and I don't know whether they're doing that in the film world in Egypt or not. I'm just wondering that.
They are.
I haven't heard, but interesting.
They are. There's Netflix Middle East, and I know certain filmmakers in Egypt that are working on shows that are specifically done for Netflix. I know like the scope is wider from just Egypt. It's the Middle East, but sorry, it's MENA, Middle East, North Africa, but there are shows and movies that are done specifically from Egyptian filmmakers and storytellers.
Interesting.
Yeah, and very recently, I think Netflix uploaded, I know Netflix uploaded a lot of Yusuf Shaheen films.
And Netflix also playing a lot of Egyptian plays, Yusuf Shaheen films, comedy films. If you just type in Egypt and Netflix US, you're going to find like a list.
Okay, I will. I'll do that. Great. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
With regards to the point about 1001 Nights being Orientalist in its essence, I agree. I'm just saying, well, first of all, I haven't read the Arabic, so I don't want to fully agree to that. I would agree that the English text is Orientalist. I don't know what the Arabic text, how that sounds. But what my question is a matter of lens and perspective. So in our lens, it was interpreted one way. And in the other lens, it's automatically interpreted in this Orientalist vision.
Well, Dina, we have a question about, can you tell people who the guy in our poster is?
So that was the joke, was that people that are familiar with Fuad al-Muhandis are going to know that it's Fuad al-Muhandis. And that was a still from a specific play. What was the play, Salma? Lock Up Your Daughters, which is Lock Up Your Daughter. I can't remember the translation, but it actually is on Netflix. It's one of the things that got uploaded on Netflix recently. Yeah.
Yep.
So that's the joke about having him on the poster, is that automatically you know that there are some people that are going to understand and some people that are not. And by choosing to exclude him, you've already decided you're filtering that lens, rather than encouraging the conversation. Well, who's that guy? Already people have learned something by me including him in the poster.
Yeah. That was a fun discovery.
And also Egyptians feel represented.
I know. And who else? If you're talking about Egyptian theater, who else in Fuad Muhandis you want to put on that poster? Well, Shfikar with him right next to him, but cool. I'm just I'm looking through the chat to see if there are like major questions that need to be answered. Khalifa, you have a question? Hi.
Hello.
Go for it. Hi.
This was brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a point that Dina mentioned about. I think it was a really important point, that there's no really a neutral adaptation, no matter what one does. I think sort of. I'm just discussing really. It's not a question, but I think there's a difference that when we adapt, say, a place from the classical Western theater in Egypt, we do have this advantage of sort of like being on the other side of the actual power balance. And so when we do it the other way around, it becomes a bit more sensitive. When we I'll give an example from here in Bahrain, for example. There's a project that I've been trying to work on, which is to adapt Egyptian theater to a Bahraini audience. And even when I read it in English, say the Tawfiq al-Hakim's plays from the 70s when they're translated into English, and presented to an English-speaking audience here, or even to an Arabic-speaking audience, I can't get over this fact. I'm not even sure how to sort of adapt it while catering to this lens. And I'm trying hard to imagine the audience as a fish. And maybe I should just like stop thinking about that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you could talk more about what's adapting Egyptian theater specifically to Western audiences and what that actually entails.
To be quite honest, from my experience, I haven't had to adapt Egyptian plays to the Western to the Western stage. What I've worked on mostly has been adapting a narrative, a novel, to become on the Western stages. That being said, I did have, I don't know if you want to call this adaptation or not, but Yusuf Idris's El Farafir, the Flim Flams. I was asked to present once with a group of actors, and we had the translation that was written in the 70s. And that was hard. That was tough to watch, tough to work on, because everything about the humor is gone. Even the English language that was used in it was definitely heavier than the language that the day-to-day American uses. So even showing that to an academic American audience was still, like, there were so many layers that I can tell people were alienated and completely distanced from what that show actually wants to do. It's a socialist show that wants to include people, and it just defies the purpose. So I've been trying to figure out ways how, because Khalifa, as you know as well, like most of our Egyptian classics were translated a while ago and no one really revisited them again. So you already have that time, because we no longer generate plays or text.
Okay, here's a question, Salma. Do you put this in mind when you adapt Egyptian works to the theater? Do you keep in mind that there might be an Egyptian in the audience who might get or might feel offended at something? Because this is a question I have no answer to.
Yes, I do. I want every single Egyptian audience member who walks into that stage to feel joy when they see details in there and nuances that only us Egyptians understand. I definitely want to get my message across to the Western audience. I'm not saying that the priority is to the Egyptian audience, but I work so hard. Like, an example. I was working on a play by Yusuf Gindi at Mosaic Theater Company last January. And the play is about an Egyptian immigrant who, moves to the US. He lives in New York. He leads a life there. and Yusuf Aguindi did great in representing the character, but as a dramaturg, and what I do is that I suggested a few things, just little nuances, you know, like there's a scene where his mom sends him kahk from Egypt. So we made that happen in a Macintosh tin. Every single Egyptian who's sitting in that, and the audience loved it. Or listening to, like when we were listening, like when he was playing songs, I strayed away from the norms of like Kulthum and Abdel Halim, or more like I focused on pop things like Ihab Tawfiq and Amr Diab, and you know, so when Itragga Fiya, the song came out, like one of my friends was like, this is I can tell that someone who is Egyptian working on that piece. None of those details affect the themes and the storytelling of the play, but they do make a whole lot of difference to an audience member that is from the culture. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, like I personally work more with the improv theater, so this is a problem that it's kind of a bit different, you know, having unscripted theater, but when it comes to representing characters. And I was having this discussion with a friend of mine who's here as well, listening to this talk, and like as a bunch of people who have to take up characters on stage on the spot. I mean, it translates to, for example, if there is a troupe that has Bahrainis and Egyptians, for example, actors, I'm talking actors, and then the scenes involve other people who are, shall we say, marginalized people in society, shall we say, for example, a character of an addict, or a character of a human trafficked sex worker, or etc. Then how is it that one actually represents this character in a stage where the scene actually is a social reflection of something happening in the improv stage without offending that character, if that character is sitting in the audience? Because at the end of the day, in a way, and you might agree or disagree with this, but as actors on the stage, we do have some privilege, and when we represent others, and this does translate to race as well. It does translate to culture. I think it's a matter of the lens that you mentioned in the end. Like if we are going to portray characters of, like, what one trick we do on stage, for example, just as an example, is the context of the Gulfi sponsor versus the Egyptian worker, for example, and we are presenting this on stage. We tend to switch the roles when it comes to actors. For example, it's an alternative universe where the Gulfi is going to Egypt, and he is being sponsored by an Egyptian, in which case the Egyptian does everything you would expect the Gulfi to do. I'm talking very stereotypically, very as a trope, but we reverse it completely in an improv universe. So you tend to bring the message across, but this is the freedom we have in improv, which is absurdist, working in an absurdist world. But it's this problem of adaptation is always a problem, and it's never neutral. There's always some bias in it, and that's why I think what you're saying is really important. Actually, I'll stop talking now.
Sorry. I mean, my whole thing is Americans don't do that. Like, they don't sit there and think, oh, is an Egyptian going to understand this? Like, so I guess we could get into the nitty gritty of like, what can you actually really do? Like, what are the points that you could do? But part of me is like, why? Why, when you could just tell the story? I went a few years ago and watched a Palestinian play. It was completely in Palestinian, about I guess it was a group of men that were trapped in a church because they were resistance fighters and stuff like that. I don't remember the whole story off the top of my head, but they spoke completely in Palestinian Arabic. There was a screen that translated everything they said word for word, and I didn't like suddenly not understand everything. You know, I didn't need to understand everything about Palestine. Like, I understood what was immediately happening in the moment. And the same goes for like the shows that I watch on Netflix. I've been watching a bunch of Korean TV dramas. They're not catering to my lens. They're doing stuff for their people. You know, they're doing it so that their people can recognize themselves. But A, I understood the story plot because it was well written, and B, I didn't need to understand everything about Korea in order to understand the story. So I think it's this assumption that we make that if we don't explain every single thing, that people are not going to understand. There's a difference between over-explaining and good writing, you know? Like, I'm not going to say what is good writing because I suppose that's subjective, but if you sit there and spend your time trying to over-explain, then I don't think you're obliged to do that. I don't think that will make your story better. In fact, if I have to sit there and listen to people explain Egyptian culture while I'm watching a play, that is boring. I mean, obviously there are some instances where things really, really don't translate, and that's where it comes into play. But I don't think anyone should approach it with, I need to find all these clever ways to explain it. I think we should understand that people have a greater capacity of understanding different cultures, you know? But I'm unforgiving in that respect.
Well, given that we are actually in those rooms because we are considered representational of our culture, so we do. It's a burden, and at the same time it's a blessing. It's a blessing when we are talking about Egyptian culture that I can easily say yes I know this, or no I don't, versus when I'm brought into a room simply because I'm from the MENA region, and then I'm expected to represent all of it, which without understanding the nuances that every single country has its own language. It's really hard. Like, I mean, language really gets to me. It's really heartbreaking that when people just want to translate things, so to go with the easy way out, instead of translating things into the dialect of the plays, they just decide to have the characters speak into, like, with just classical Arabic, classical, what do you want, what's it called, and I'm like, that again, that alienates me as an audience member, because it's hard. Like, even I haven't seen Rami, but yesterday when Dina was showing me the clip, it seemed like they worked really hard to get the actors to speak in colloquial Egyptian accent and like dialect. But there was one word that he said, the moment he said it, I was like, oh, this guy does not speak Egyptian. Like, it would just completely throw me off. Even though, again, to a Western audience member, who cares? Like, they don't even understand the language. They're going to read the subtitles. But to someone like me, who was seeing that man in the countryside of Egypt using that terminology, I was like I wasn't even watching it. I was listening to it, and I was like, Dina, wait, can I listen to all of this again? So language is definitely
I think there's a raised hand.
Yeah. We have 5 more minutes, and we have a lot of questions. Ali has amazing comments, and so is Ahmed Ashur. But there's a question that I feel also Khalifa like tapped on earlier, which is there a way to represent or do 1001 Nights without it being Orientalist, given that it's an Orientalist story from the get-go? I don't know the answer to that, but I know that, I mean,
about the translation, because I don't, like I said, what does the Arabic like?
But that's the whole point. It wasn't written by an Arabic person. 1001 Nights was not.
But I'm saying it was, sorry, I'm looking at the question in the chat. I will think about that. I'm saying that the stories were collected and then written in English, but they were collected by Arab speakers.
They were collected by not just Arab speakers. This is the thing. It was collected from the Arab world and back then Persia. So, and some stories in India. So it was, that's Arabia. But it was still, I mean, even within the collection and the curation of it was done through a Western lens. You know what I mean? Like the ordering of things, and the ordering on its own is enough of how the structure of your storytelling is a lens on its own. But yeah, I do see an opportunity into revisiting a lot of the things in 1001 Nights and Egyptianizing it in a way that removes that Orientalist lens. Cool. We have 3 more minutes to go.
Did raise their hand.
Oh, I didn't see. Sorry, I don't have the full view. I do now.
I think it was Ahmed.
Yes.
Hi, friends. Are we good for time? I don't want to keep anyone past.
We have 3 more minutes to go. You're good.
Great. I'll be quick. First of all, incredible that you worked with Yusuf Al-Gindi on Pilgrims, Sherry, and Musa, because I directed one of his works, Back of the Throat, for my thesis project, and we actually ended up connecting, and so I love that man so much. And so first of all, I want to touch upon that. Also, the second thing that I want to talk about is something that I agree, I struggle with as an Egyptian theater maker who is partially based in the MENA region and in the US, is, and I think this is relatable across different races, just the feel that I need to specifically work on work that relives the trauma of the Arab American experience and the Egyptian American experience. And specifically when it comes to a post 9/11 context. And so, especially with Black Lives Matter and everything that has been going on recently, a question that I have is, how can we as Arab theater makers almost stop orientalizing ourselves in that way and actually move towards, as Dina and you talked about so beautifully, is this, how do we create moments of unapologetic Egyptian and Arab joy on stage that are not specifically trying to cater towards this white need to see us live through our traumas, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a question I ask myself all the time. I mean, I don't have an answer to it. I think that's also a thing that I didn't think about before moving here, and the question just keeps on raising itself as you become uncomfortable with certain things viscerally without knowing why, and then finding the right words for them and finding the right emotion of what is this? Why am I uncomfortable with working on that piece? What is it that is, because again, to a Western audience or to a Western lens, that's how they would like to see it, but why isn't that okay with me? And still trying to find ways to navigate that. It's not, especially that we work within, as we said, within the MENA community, which is great, and they do great work, but most of the producers are white, predominantly white institutions. So we all have to cater to it at a certain point without us wanting to, but now we're trying to push against it. Dina and I actually had a lot of conversations about, should we do this workshop or not? It's
right. And I think also, something that I'm thinking about is just how, and this is going to be super brief, is just I feel we just need more quantity of plays. I think we just need more, because right now I feel our experience is sort of limited to a certain select number of plays that we kind of produce over and over again. And then we're oh, this is this is the example of the MENA based work or the MENA sourced work. And so, yeah, again, I think it is a question of quantity for me as well. Sorry, Dina, I feel I cut you off.
No, it's okay. I agree with you. I think it's a matter of quantity, and this idea that even within the Arab American sphere, that we need to do something that's very easily recognizable for the white American audience. There was a musical about the Egyptian Revolution, and the people that they narrowed it down to was the Egyptian upper class, who is technically the most familiar to the Western audience, but that's not necessarily everybody that was in Tahrir or stuff like that, or representative of society as a whole. I'm not saying that it's anyone's obligation, but that's just something to bear in mind, that this is the lens that you are following. So I very much feel in answer to your question of how do we make sure that we're not catering to an audience, I'm well, stop thinking about the audience, you know? I come from a costume design background, so I can't really give advice on actually writing, but my focus has always been am I true to the culture? Am I really representing them the way they feel represented? You know, and then the questions of, I don't know, it's kind of hard because why focus on if they understand or not? That's the whole, I think Adam wrote in his
Dina,
on the comments, there's value in some people not understanding. These are teachable moments. We learned about the Western culture because we didn't fully understand things. Well, I mean, I'm a bad example because I grew up in the West, but.
Okay, sorry, we really have to go because the person behind us needs to start setting up. I have all of your emails and I saved that chat, and I would love us to just, you know, start a thread and discuss this further. Thank you so much for joining us today and giving us your thoughts. Bye.
Bye.